Thank you very much for waiting. The moderator is Mr. Nor Schneider, and the panelists are Ms. Bassam Sinat and Mr. Bill Emmett and Ms. Mogherini. So could you please refer to the pamphlet for their background?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you all in the audience for sticking with us today, and thank you to this distinguished group of panelists for being here. It's my honor and pleasure to moderate this discussion. We've already had a terrific introduction to the lay of the land, and I won't stop us with long biographies of these distinguished folks who really need no introduction. We have Ms. Federica Mogherini, Mr. Bill Emmett, and Ms. Marie Doha Besacenot. Thank you again all for joining us. The war in Ukraine, which began now 3 years ago as of next month, full-scale war in Ukraine, has brought the security situations in Europe and the Indo-Pacific much closer. At first, this was on a conceptual level, questions about how the end game in Ukraine would affect deterrence or decision-making by autocrats here in Asia, and in particular fears around Xi Jinping's intentions towards Taiwan. As former Prime Minister Kishida Fumio put it here in Japan, Ukraine today could become East Asia tomorrow. In recent months and in the past year, those linkages have become even more concrete. We've seen Russia and North Korea enter into a new security alliance. We now have North Korean shells and North Korean soldiers fighting and dying on the battlefields of Europe. The inauguration of the second Trump administration has, of course, brought to the White House a man who believes he can end the conflict within 24 hours. Tellingly, that hasn't happened yet. But I'm hoping that this panel will help us to shed some light on the complexities of the situation, the conflict in Ukraine, its implications for the security situation here in the Indo-Pacific, and where this all might go under a second Trump administration. And I'd like to start with Ms. Mogherini to ask, just to lay out how you see these linkages between the security situation in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, how it compares perhaps to your time in office as Foreign Minister or High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs for the European Union during the first phase of this war in Ukraine.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank for the invitation, the inauguration, the organization of this conference, but most of all for the choice of the keynote speaker for this session. I think that hearing the views of such a distinguished minister from not only Estonia, but a Baltic country, not just a European, but a European that comes from a country that has so deep knowledge about Russia and the attitudes that the Russian leadership at this moment has towards Ukraine and the east of Europe, is particularly important to be heard in this audience and in this region. Why I say so? Because you mentioned rightly so, the fully fledged invasion of Ukraine started 3 years ago, but the war in Ukraine started more than 10 years ago. And before that, there were already signs with Georgia, and not only, that the Russian plan to expand, or actually I would say to affirm the sphere of influence concept was serious, something that the Estonians or the Baltics or the Eastern Europeans have never doubted about. Not everybody in Europe has believed in that in the past. And I think that what really is relevant today is that in Europe there is a sense of realism that probably we have not had in the past. And I think it is important to reflect on this here, because I know Japan has always been in these years very much on the same side as Europeans on the reaction to that. But I think that in the region there might be different perceptions at times on the threats and on the impact of what is happening in Ukraine. The connection with North Korea, obviously, and with China, obviously now are more evident. But I think that one key element that sometimes is not underlined enough is this. The Russian fully fledged invasion military traditionally, the traditional concept of warfare, while we were with NATO and with the European Union always working on you know, the hybrid scenarios, which are very interesting. But I remember just 3 years ago we were thinking before the NATO summit, what is going to be the next big mission for NATO after Afghanistan. Now we are, you know, with tanks and with a 2 centuries ago kind of warfare. But what is striking is that here we have a permanent member of the Security Council that is military invading a neighboring country with the purpose of changing borders. And this has never happened before. This is not only a security threat, this is, I think, a major step in dismantling the global governance and the architecture that has governed, with shortcomings, but has governed the world in the last decades, almost century now. And this is why I believe this new security situation has an impact everywhere in the world, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Because once the rules of the game are questioned by those that are supposed to implement them, there's no rule of the game anymore. There's no security architecture anymore. There's no governance anymore. There's nothing that holds anymore. And I believe that now we are in a moment where leaders around the world are testing the limits and watching each other to learn and to see what is allowed in a framework where everything is allowed, because no one is holding each other responsible anymore if we don't have a collective global reaction. And this is why I believe it's so important to build a global understanding of what is happening. I was in office during the first Trump administration. It was not easy. It was not pleasant. I think the second Trump administration, and if I may be completely blunt and candid, I've always been, even when I was in office, I will be even more now that I'm not in office. I think that the second Trump administration will be much different than the first one, because the machine has been already tested. The priorities are clearer on the president's side. And I believe that we will see things we have not seen before, not for the better. What I have experienced during the first Trump administration was that he definitely doesn't like rules, multilateral settings, and anything that is a constraint, or he perceives as a constraint to his capacity to do whatever he thinks he wants to do or likes to do. No rules, no rules. Doesn't like the UN, doesn't like the European Union, nothing that is multilateral at all. And I believe that this is something that both Russia and China appreciate. And I believe that this will already has very deep connections with the domestic trends that are happening in many parts of the world, in Europe, not only in Latin America, everywhere else. And I'll finish with that, I'm sorry I've been very long, I would say, a foreign policy agenda and a domestic political agenda that coincides, that is interconnected. The support for extreme right movements across the world, and especially in Europe, but also in Latin America, coincides with the dismantling of the international rules-based order, because one reinforces the other. And this is what scares me the most. Then I'll try to find something more positive for the second round.
I fear that this won't be the most positive of panels overall, but we can search for some silver linings. There's a lot I'd love to come back to, but first, Bill, I'd love to hear from you a bit. You've been watching not only Europe but Japan and Asia for years now. I'm curious how you see the reaction here in Japan, the reaction throughout Asia to the war in Ukraine. How has the war in Ukraine, the security situation in Europe, shaped thinking about security here in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much to Ambassador Sasai for inviting me, and delighted to be on a panel moderated by Noah Snyder, of course, having come from the same family as me, the economist. So the observation that you've asked for, I think above all, the war in Ukraine has been absolutely seen as a proof that we are in a new era of danger and imperialism, a new form of imperialism, changing of borders by force, as Federica Mogherini said, with the often forgotten, but I think not forgotten in this region, precursor 3 weeks before the invasion of the joint statement between China and Russia, signed in Beijing by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, stating an absolutely clear mission to change, by which one means destroy the existing world rules-based order. So, and I think that text, that joint statement, was taken extremely seriously in this region, in part as a confirmation of what many in the region already knew was the case, that the big threat was domination by the rising power of China, and of, as it were, a similarly imperialistic frame of mind that could be expressed through it, but also as, in a way, a wake-up call about how this could actually pan out. I do think, looking positively, what has also been observed, perhaps the negative thing to remember is that the war in Ukraine showed how difficult it is to deter a great power from making such an invasion. The task of deterrence is a very hard one, but more positively, the incredible bravery of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military in fighting back, in really preventing Russia from achieving what it was aiming at, but then actually the level of support that Ukraine received from neighbors like the Baltic states, from other European countries, and from the United States. I know President Trump doesn't like them listed in that order, but nonetheless, financially speaking, that is the order in which the support has gone. I think that the level of Western support of Ukraine in support of the principles of the rule-based order, but also in support of Ukraine and its continued sovereignty as an independent country, has been remarkable, impressive, and widely noted in this region as well. So, and I'm sure in Beijing too. So I think that those lessons are there and should be seen as more positive, but there's no doubt that we are in an age of a certain form of imperialistic behavior, and ultimately the greatest worry about Trump 2.0 is that he's part of the same trend.
We will come certainly back to the Trump-sized elephant in the room, but again, to turn to a NATO perspective, as mentioned earlier, we've seen Japan opening up an embassy to NATO, a representative office. We've seen Japanese leaders and even South Korean leaders joining NATO summits in recent years. These institutional linkages between NATO and governments here in the Indo-Pacific have also been strengthening in the wake of the full-scale invasion. Marie-Doha, I'm curious to hear a bit from you from a NATO perspective on how you've seen the relationships with the Indo-Pacific change, how you think about this new nexus, this new partnership.
Yes, thank you for this question, and thank you to the JIA for inviting NATO to this forum. And I think the stage that we have here with an allied political leader, with the European Union, with civil society, and with NATO, all this happening in Tokyo is exactly how we envisage collective security right now at NATO. It's very emblematic of how we see things. I've joined NATO exactly 1.5 years ago, and I can tell you indeed that partnerships have been absolutely central in our discussions. I arrived for the Vilnius summit, and so what I can say is that, of course, among NATO's core tasks, the notion of cooperative security is absolutely central. And so in Madrid, I mean, since the full-scale invasion, partners from the Indo-Pacific have been really, really closely associated with the reflection on collective security. So that's Madrid, that's Vilnius, that's Washington, but at an even more pragmatic scale, and that is the regular meetings happening at NATO, which is NATO's battle rhythm, which are the ministerial meetings every other month. We've also had ministers, foreign ministers, and then defense ministers for the first time in November associated at NATO from this region. So yes, there is a clear idea that solutions must be found together. This is, of course, happening via tailor-made partnerships, and Japan has had such cooperation with NATO since the 90s. Now they're being specified. We've signed a shared agenda for tackling security challenges in 2022, and in Washington it became even more concrete with the definition of four flagship areas for cooperation, including cyber, including support to Ukraine, of course, including hybrid or information threats. So yes, I would say it's getting more and more concrete. And whether it was Secretary General Stoltenberg or Secretary General Rutte, because we've had a change of leadership recently, the continuum is very obvious regarding partners, and they will be still central in the months to come.
So we began with the war in Ukraine. You began your remarks with the war in Ukraine. I'd like to come back to the war in Ukraine. Obviously, all around the world, folks are thinking about the next phase of the war, about potential end games. I'm curious to hear a bit about what you see as the potential best case outcomes and the potential worst case outcomes, and what the implications might be for the Indo-Pacific, for other parts of the world. And maybe we can go in order down the line here.
Well, thank you very much, and once again, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm glad to share my thoughts. Well, we all understand that every war will have an end in one moment, and also Russian war of aggression in Ukraine will stop in one moment. Now is the question that are we helping Ukraine to shape this end in their favor, or Russia will get what they want or what it wants. And as I see it, of course, we will have a lot of push, especially from the Trump administration, to end this war as soon as possible. Now is the question that what is the end game, as you asked, and it is in our power. It is in our possibility to help Ukrainians shape this negotiation table. So you cannot go to the negotiations, especially with Russia, from the weakened position. So you can go to the negotiations only from the strength position. And in a way, I really applaud to the Republicans, doctrine from Reagan time, peace to strength. It is so that you can achieve peace through strength, but the underline has to be on the word strength, not on the peace, because when you have only aim as a peace, then you will negotiate and then you will agree on everything. So just to end the war. But when you start these negotiations from the strength position, then you at least have the chance to get the result you are looking for. First, what we are looking for. We are looking for the just peace. That means that these people responsible for the war crimes, for these atrocities, they have to come into the justice. They have to take the responsibility. And also Russia has to pay for these damages, for these atrocities, what they have caused to Ukrainian nation, to Ukrainian people, to Ukraine as a nation, as a country. Second, this peace has to be long-lasting. We cannot end this war for 5 days. So when this war will be over, or when the ceasefire will be announced or agreed, then this ceasefire has to have the goal to end with the peace treaty. So these two marks, just and long-lasting, are definitely the ones we have to strive forward with. What is important? Of course, we have to understand that Ukraine has to have a very clear security guarantees. We cannot say to Ukraine that, okay, let's have the peace deal and you will not have any security guarantees. Of course, the best security guarantee for Ukraine is the membership in NATO. And from Estonian perspective, I am 120% sure that if there is a threat towards Estonia and Ukraine is in NATO, our Ukrainian friends are the first ones, together with us, fighting for our freedom. So I have no doubt. And second point, of course, Ukraine has the only army today in the world who is fighting and has the fighting experience with Russia. And they are doing that successfully. Thirdly, they are using all the equipment what NATO has today in use. So they are the world champions of interoperability. So they are using the Russian tanks, they are using the Leopards, the most modern tanks, they are using the HIMARS, all the systems, and they are successfully using that. So I don't see any reason why Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. The most difficult part to go to the negotiations is about the territorial integrity. And from Estonian perspective, from the European perspective, we will never recognize that territorial integrity will not be reestablished. And one thing I really do not know, why, when someone is saying that, that Putin is right, that, that Crimea is part of Russia or Eastern Ukraine is part of Russia. Pardon me, why you are taking this moment from the history, which you like? You cannot, then let's go back to history to the 15th century. Then the size of Russia was the Moscow Oblast. And as Ukrainians are saying, let's make Russia small again. So why you are taking the time from 1990? When we take also the Ottoman Empire, which was very close to Moscow. When we take also the Lithuanian, Polish state, which was very close to Moscow. Why you are taking this moment and saying that I have the right to these territories? No, you don't. So to conclude, I believe that we have to stand for the just peace and that Russia will be accountable for these crimes, what they have committed in Ukraine. And Ukraine will have a long-lasting peace with their own choices, with their own right to say how they want to live in Ukraine in future.
So, Federica, taking these principles, a just peace, accountability, a long-lasting peace, a peace treaty, clear security guarantees, and territorial integrity as a jumping-off point, you're acutely aware of the political realities, and we now have a new political reality in Donald Trump. Even a Biden administration was opposed to Ukraine's membership in NATO. It's hard to see a Trump administration coming around to that idea. Jumping off from these principles, but applying some of these political realities, what do you see as a best case and a worst case outcome?
I'm thinking hard on the best case. Obviously, the best realistic case. Obviously, the best case scenario is indeed Ukraine keeping its territorial integrity or regaining its territorial integrity, which, by the way, is also somehow a requirement, a condition, or in any case, a need for the European Union to proceed. You know that Ukraine was granted candidate status to enter the European Union. There is an issue of to which territory the acquis of the European Union applies, what is part of the European Union. So clearly territorial integrity, I think, comes first, but also for what I was saying before, it's the guarantee that international law is respected, that internationally recognized borders are kept and preserved. All the other things that rightly the minister mentioned, I would add maybe another element. The best case scenario is democracy in Ukraine. Because let's not forget that, and this brings me to the worst case scenario in my mind, that is really, I think, a nightmare if we imagine going that direction. We know that, that Russia has often and still plays quite a lot with, I would say, certain quite advanced degree of manipulation of internal electoral democratic systems. We've seen what has happened recently, even in countries of the European Union or in Georgia. I would say the worst case scenario, in my view, is a manipulation of the public opinion and the political landscape inside Ukraine that will lead to a complete change of political orientation of the Ukrainian leadership under influence from the Kremlin, and potentially a leadership in the future in Ukraine that brings Ukraine in the sphere of influence of Moscow politically and not militarily. To me, that would be the worst case scenario, because that would somehow disregard the sacrifices and will of the Ukrainian people. But it has happened in the past. It might happen in the future, and I think this is what we need really to be to pay attention to. That there is not a manipulation of the public opinion and the electoral system inside Ukraine that basically brings a friendly government to lead the country in the future. Which means that to all the principles that the minister was mentioning, I would add nurturing a healthy, transparent, accountable democratic system inside Ukraine, which is, I would say, a very solid and important conditions for the will of the Ukrainian people to be represented.
Bill, I'm curious how you see the end game in Ukraine affecting deterrence here in the Indo-Pacific. You've just published a book on deterrence and the risk of conflict in Taiwan. It's out in Japanese with the exciting title of How to Stop World War III. Does the end of the war in Ukraine, the shape it takes, impact deterrence around Taiwan? And if so, how do you see that impact?
I think I think about it in two ways. I mean, one way that we need to look at the way the war ends in Ukraine is what it tells us about the strength of what was referred to earlier as the new axis of evil, I mean, of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Does that general threat, which of course obviously China is at the center of it, is it stronger after a settlement in Ukraine, or is it weaker? And I think I have some optimism about the situation, because I think if you look back at 2024, it was clearly a disastrous year for Iran. It was a pretty bad year for Russia, which continued to lose huge amounts of men and material, turned its economy onto a war footing, but actually made very little progress on the battlefield in Ukraine, proportionate at least to what it put in. It was a poor year for China, which has its economy in a state of some disarray and clearly entering a period of deflation and difficulty. Xi Jinping's position is not getting stronger, it's getting weaker. Let's leave North Korea out there, a sort of detail on the end of it. So I think that actually this threat has gone through this war in Ukraine and been diminished by it. Now, that doesn't mean that deterrence of an invasion of Taiwan is therefore easier, but I do think that the threat of these authoritarian, if you like, rule-changing, disrupting powers actually is looking weaker now than it was before. The settlement in the war in Ukraine, I think one shouldn't leave aside the fundamental test of it is whether the Ukrainian people are happy about it. Is this a sustainable peace that the people of Ukraine can live with and will have a democracy that is robust enough to make it sustainable? That's test number one. Test number two to me is this a peace that the people of Russia are unhappy about, insofar as they understand it and know about it? And I actually think that the best case scenario is that we have a settlement that leads, maybe not immediately, but inexorably to a change of leadership in Russia. I'm not saying that it's good, that that's something that one can be instant about, but that really undermines the credibility of Vladimir Putin as a leader. Now, if that were to happen, I think that that would have something of a deterrent effect on Xi Jinping over Taiwan. Looking at the two situations, clearly there's a big historical and ideological nationalistic desire to absorb Taiwan, but China is actually relatively risk-averse compared with Russia, and therefore I think that China is eminently deterrable if there is credible evidence that they would be fighting a much larger war if they were to take it on, but also if there were credible evidence that the risks to the regime and to the integrity of China were great if you take this action. And so I do think that an outcome in Ukraine that really does count as a clear failure for Russia, and that leads to a process of change, a weakening of Putin, and then a process of change, will be highly noted in Beijing.
We've talked a lot about the war in Ukraine and the linkages here with the Indo-Pacific. I'd like to circle back a bit to President Trump and to the threat from within the NATO alliance or from within the multilateral system. It's no secret, as Federica mentioned, his disdain for multilateral institutions. The relationship with NATO was testy during the first Trump administration. Marie-Do, I'm curious to hear a bit about how NATO sees Trump 2.0 compared to Trump 1.0. How is the relationship going to develop, do you think, during this second Trump administration?
There's a lot I don't know, but what is sure is that indeed NATO has an experience with the first administration, and that there was one very clear message expressed by President Trump, which was, let's make sure that the European allies invest in their own defense. And that message has been heard loud and clear. And I think the first element is that NATO allies are in a very different position today than they were in 2014, where we had only 3 allies investing 2% of their GDP in defense. And we now have 2/3 of the allies doing this, which is a very different place. Previous Secretary General Stoltenberg spent most of his mandate really convincing allies to get there, making sure this trajectory was strong, moving from a ceiling to a floor in Vilnius, the 2% being a floor, not a ceiling, and so on. And we've heard Minister say that some nations are already way beyond that. And yes, Poland, Estonia are among those nations. So clearly this will continue. And I think a panelist said something very well phrased early on today, saying the question that President Trump will be asking is, what are you doing for yourself? And then what are you doing for the US? And I really believe that NATO has a very good story to tell for 2 of these questions. What are we doing for ourselves? What are European allies doing for themselves? A lot, investing. And that is not only figures, not only 2% or 3%, it's also interoperability. We've been investing in the most impressive joint exercises last year, with the largest exercise since the end of the Cold War, Steadfast Defender, with 90,000 troops. That's really something. And we have capability targets, and then we have really improved this high readiness of the alliance with combat-ready troops. So it's not only quality figures, quantity figures, it's also quality interoperability.
Federica, you mentioned earlier the linkage between domestic politics and the international system, the parallels between this breakdown of a rules-based order internationally and the rise of populism and far-right figures in individual countries. I'm curious what the impact of Trump's re-election is on European policies and politics and the knock-on effect on security policy, foreign policy, as you see it.
the easy question. Before I go there, if I can just comment on what was just said about Europeans investing on their own security. I think there are two layers of this discourse in the United States, if I may. I think that the push for Europeans to take responsibility, the 2%, was really started actually as an Obama agenda in the Wales NATO summit, and has always been a US point of the agenda, regardless of the color of the color of the president. I think that with Trump, it's not only Europeans investing in their own defense, but also buying American for doing that, which adds a flavor to that, which again is legitimate, but it might also be legitimate for Europeans to question whether they want to go in that direction or rather invest more in the European industry of defense, which is a different story. The connection between the disruption of the international rules-based global order and far-right movements, more than populist. It's populist, but I think right now it's really an openly an extreme right movements or a wave of extreme right leaders or parties on the rise. I see this as today as two faces of the same coin, and one, the domestic agenda reinforces the external one, and the external one reinforces the domestic one. In Europe, this is particularly relevant. You have the leaders, the few leaders that are more vocal inside the European Union, for instance, on questioning the need to stand at the side of Ukraine and support Ukraine. Those that have raised questions on, at the end of the day, part of Ukraine might, what the minister was referring to, there might be historical reasons or cultural reasons, religious reasons for part of Ukraine to be connected with Russia somehow. Those that are raising these arguments in Europe are also those that are challenging the rule of law and democratic system inside their own countries, being it on rule of law, on human rights, on women's rights, on democracy, or on the European Union very same pillars. So it's quite evident that the two agendas are connected, and we see emerging inside Europe, but I think also in other countries. Again, I think this is more visible in Latin America and in Europe. We also see somehow an international of support to this kind of narrative and leaders that goes through the traditional political channels, political parties, electoral campaigns, Bannon campaigning in Europe, and so on and so forth, Musk campaigning in Europe, in Germany, but also through disinformation campaigns and social media, where the truth is challenged, dismantled, and in a way that really pushes an agenda both on the international and domestic side, with a very coherent approach, very worrying, but very coherent approach. And in Europe, we have, all elections are important, but we have elections in Germany and in France coming up, among others. And clearly, this is something that we need to watch very carefully and try to avoid external interference from wherever it can come. I have to say on the positive side, because I've not been too positive during this panel, the European elections, even if they have seen a shift a little bit more to the right, the extreme right, here it's not about traditional right and left. This is really about the extreme positions. And yet, the result in terms of institutional setup has been a good one, a stable one that has given the European Union leadership that has a continuity on the pattern of the policies that we have had before. So the European Union has managed to absorb, from an institutional point of view, this political wave. We will see if individual countries in Europe will manage to do the same. I think the German system, for instance, is complex enough to absorb this shock waves. The French system, being a presidential system, is a different kind of story, but there's a bit more time on that. But I think that this is really the other big challenge, and that might have an influence also in the Indo-Pacific, because it will have an influence on the way in which Europeans, individual countries or the European Union will relate to the rest of the world, again on respect of international rules and norms.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor for questions. In particular, if anyone has questions for the minister who's going to have to leave us in about 10 minutes from now, why don't we start with those? I think we have time for a couple of questions for him, and then we can open things up to questions for the rest of the panelists. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question is that it seems to me that Trump administration may be considering to involve China into the possible solution of the Ukrainian war over there. Do you think that there could be specific role which should be played by China and which could be asked by us? My sense is that it's costly if we ask them to play some role over there. I believe that there should be plenty of room where China can play a role for the solution. However, there is a very small room where we can actually ask them, because it costs a lot. They would certainly ask us in return something which could be hurting our national interest. So my question is, do you think that there would be some specific role and for the China to play for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, and actually whether we can ask them to do that? Thank you.
Well, first of all, again, the first understanding has to be very clear that no peace without Ukraine. That nobody can go to Ukrainians, nobody can go to President Zelensky and say that, please, here is the peace deal, take it. So it cannot be like this. And we've seen already also from previous year that China wanted to play that role. Let's do not forget that. There was an offer on the table. So I fully agree that, when China comes into the play, there will be also, when you say A, there will be a B, or when you take the coin, there will be also avers and reverse. So anyway, as I see it, when there will be a facilitator, then facilitator should do the facilitator job, not to demand anything. And to be honest, I don't see that there has to be any facilitator. It's up to the Ukrainians and Russians in one moment to sit behind the table and conclude the peace. When Estonia had its independence war in 1918 to 1920 against Russia, then we concluded also the peace deal, peace treaty, not with some help. We concluded it between Estonia and Russia. So anyway, I would avoid that kind of discussions that let's bring China in or let's bring anyone in. We know anyway that the US will push for it. And of course, US has a say because they are still the biggest contributors, or not the biggest one. Europe is bigger at the moment. But still they are a significant part of military aid. And I would ask maybe the question that, do we want to see, or does America wants to see that they have given billions of military aid to Ukraine and they will just pack it easily, what they would say to their own voters. So it's a complicated question, but I would try to keep away China from this, because they have not been the part of the conflict. They have no knowledge how it goes. When we want to start negotiations, there is an offer on the table. This is Zelensky's peace plan. Let's start from this.
Other questions in the back? Yes.
Thank you. Vipin Narang, I teach at MIT. I think we're living through the longest nuclear crisis since the advent of nuclear weapons with the Ukraine war, almost 2 years now. What are some of the lessons for the Indo-Pacific as Asia is witnessing a massive nuclear expansion in China and North Korea, both in terms of how to deter potential nuclear employment, but also for the United States now going through transition, extended deterrence arrangements? Thank you.
I will make very brief comments. Maybe the other one can continue, and then I really apologize because I really need to go. And some more general comments also. Well, first about the nuclear deterrence and nuclear threat. Well, when we go back in time to 1994, to Budapest Memorandum, which was concluded to say that Ukraine will give away all their nuclear weapons and Russia will never invade Ukraine. So this was the deal. Russia didn't respect that deal. When we go even further back in the history to Crimean War in 18th century, there was a peace treaty, Paris Treaty, where Russia promised not to invade Ukraine. They did. So Russia doesn't keep its promises. And when we talk about the nuclear deterrence and nuclear question, then of course, US has the biggest word here. And I truly believe that there is common sense in the United States government, in the White House, in Pentagon, in State Department, to avoid actual nuclear conflict. Because, you know, even when there is a tendency for North Korea or whoever to build a nuclear missile, then I would ask that even when you use the tactical nuclear weapon, what is the advantage? Let's assume that Putin will clear or will give the clearance to use the nuclear weapon, tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. What is the gain? Yes, tens of thousands of people will be killed. The cloud of nuclear cloud will maybe end up in Russia. So what is the advantage? You will not break Ukrainians with that. They have fought for their freedom for the last 3 years, heavily, losing tens of people every day. How can you say to these people in the trenches that stop now? I believe that it's not possible. And it's the same with the peace treaty. So we have to take care of that also. And just as a final comment from my side before leaving, I believe that in general we are entering to the new phase of the world order. We are entering to the more polarization. We saw that during the US campaign of the presidential elections. We've seen that in different countries, that polarization and the question of democracy versus autocracy will raise more and more. And we will see that also different other elections in different countries will have this polarization. And unfortunately, we also have to admit that the new generation of voters are not the same or have not the same view on politics as maybe, you know, this generation sitting in this room. So that means that you know, the decisions will be made based on the AI-created videos. The decisions will be made on 3-second, 5-second clips and the headlines. So sorry to say, but you know, even your job will be more difficult to explain to the readers, you know, what is behind every decision. So I just urge all of us to explain to our voters, to our people, to our populations, what is on stake and why we have to stand for democracy. It's going to be a crazy ride for the next couple of years until at least midterm elections in the United States. And I really do hope that the common sense and bright brains will not leave the decision-making process. So anyway, once again, thank you very much for the invitation, and then apologies that I have to go to have the meeting with your defense minister. So thank you very much once again.
Minister Pevker, thank you again for your time, for joining us. Just to jump off of that last question on the nuclear element, one way of reading the dynamics, the nuclear dynamics in Ukraine in recent years is that the West has effectively been deterred by Russia's nuclear threats, that Russia's nuclear threats have kept the West from ramping up support to Ukraine, have made the West more cautious when it comes to sending new weapons systems and so on. Here in the Indo-Pacific, there's obviously a concern that China could do the same thing. Bill, I'm curious again to turn to you as the expert on how to stop World War III. How do you see the nuclear dimension of a possible Taiwan contingency, and what lessons do you think China may or may not be learning from Russia's experience from the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's a great point. I mean, the reality is that what Russia has done is to flip round the nuclear question and has used its nuclear weapons as a cover, as a shield for a conventional war. And so the first point about the impact on the Indo-Pacific is that this tactic must not be seen to succeed. And it has, of course, succeeded to some degree. It has deterred or at least put some sort of a limit on Western support. And it's clearly Russia succeeded in a sort of escalation dominance, as the Cold War phrase had it. But it hasn't deterred Western support altogether, and it has, and Russia has not been very successful in the war. So the principal lesson number one, it has to be, let's discuss it after the outcome in the Ukraine to see how that looks to China. But I think the second point about potential conflict over Taiwan is that I sort of doubt that actually China would risk using that same tactic of nuclear cover for a conventional warfare, because it would, I would hope, recognize that the stakes were much higher and the likelihood of an American response would be much higher. Does depend on this president and future presidents and what kind of position they take on so-called strategic ambiguity, on really their declaration of support or otherwise for Taiwan. But I think that the calculation in Beijing would have to be, in almost any circumstance that I can imagine, that America would support Taiwan and intervene in the case of an invasion, and therefore that there was a serious risk of it escalating into a nuclear conflict. So that I think that Taiwan is more a Cuba Missile Crisis type situation than the Russian-Ukraine one, and that more conventional thinking about nuclear deterrence is really what we will return to in thinking about Taiwan, and therefore that the key issue is about arms control negotiations and about getting China into a position in which it is willing to be transparent about its nuclear program and get into talks and about numbers and locations and so forth.
I don't want to abuse my moderator's privilege too much. So again, to open things up to the floor for the rest of our panelists, other questions from the audience? Yes, Tsuruoka-sensei.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Tsuruoka, teaching at Keio University. A strong NATO is good for Europe and good for the United States. I very much believe so. But at the same time, the reality is that Europe is much bigger than Russia. So in terms of GDP, Europe's GDP is more than 10 times as big as Russia, and your defense budget as well. So Europe's defense budget is much bigger than Russia. But still, many people argue that Europe cannot defend itself from Russia without relying on the United States. So what's the biggest problem, and why, given the fact that Europe is much bigger, but why still Europe cannot defend itself vis-a-vis Russia? I'm asking this a bit provocative question because that's one of the biggest differences between Europe and Asia. Because in Asia here, China is much, much, much bigger than Japan. And it's just impossible for Japan to think of defending itself without the alliance with the United States. But in Europe, Europe is much bigger. So that's my question. Thank you.
I can start, and then I think Federica will be for you too. Why? Because Ukraine is not a member state of NATO, right? It's not an ally. Ukraine is a partner. So yes, there is a strong determination of defending allied territory, of defending 1 billion citizens inside of NATO. And I think that determination is strong. Which is why we are ramping up the defenses on, I would say, the different types of deterrence that we've been sort of alluding to. So nuclear, yes. So NATO is a nuclear alliance, and that is very strong. And the exercises I was referring to are also ramping this up. And the second is conventional, which is why defense industry now is very much central in the discussions. And the third element, which we also mentioned a little, is Stratcom, the posture, the deterrence posture in our messaging. And I think really the alliance is extremely united on all those three layers of deterrence, if I may say. But you're right. And I think both Secretary Generals have been making that point that if you compare GDPs, we should be investing a lot more in our defense, yes.
Just to put the question even more bluntly, if I may, I think really the point is about why Europe needs America, or why does Europe need America to defend itself from Russia? If so, why, and if not, why not?
Can I? How much time do we have? Honestly, I think that on one side, I think that Europeans, and this is an effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think Europeans will be able to defend themselves without the Americans. Actually, the combination of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the second Trump administration will make the Europeans able to defend themselves from Russia or wherever else. Because, and this is something that will affect also the EU Indo-Pacific relations. Today, Europeans are, for the first time in almost 80 years, worried about their own security. We have been saying for decades that Europe is a continent at peace. We cannot say that anymore. Obviously, we had the war in Yugoslavia, but apart from that, we've had decades of peace. Today, Europeans would not say that we are at peace. We are not at war, but we're not at peace either. So I think that the combination of these two factors will make Europeans not only invest on defense in terms of GDP, but also have a mentality shift. And here I come to what I believe is the real problem. Straight answer is, I believe Europeans will be able to defend themselves. And even now, I believe we would be able to defend ourselves if we would face the need to do that. Second, why is it so that up to now we haven't used the narrative of being able to do that? Because we have, it's a cultural and political thing. In Europe, we spent thousands of years killing each other, and we have caused, in different ways, 2 world wars. We have, out of that, gained the wisdom of understanding that making peace and actually building systems of economic and political cooperation is more convenient than killing each other at war. And we are proud of that. And we want to keep that and preserve that. So the narrative of being ready for war is not a European narrative, or at least has not been so far. We don't feel comfortable, we don't like to, and I think this resonates in Japan, right? I know that there is one article in the Japanese constitution that is exactly the same wording as an article in the Italian constitution, and I guess this comes from history. We are proud of being a project of peace. And obviously this doesn't match with the times we're living now, where we have to be ready for war. I think we are readapting our narrative. I think we have the technology, I think we have the money, definitely. We need to work on the interoperability. We have a very fragmented capability system across Europe. NATO is helping, the European defense is helping, and this will accelerate. But I think that the main point is the cultural thing. In the last 20, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Europeans have dismantled a lot of their, for instance, how do you say in English? The obligatory military service, conscription. The trend has always been towards that of being cooperative power, based on the production of norms and standards and building partnerships around the world, not our military power. Now, obviously, we have to recalibrate that. Europe is ready to do that. We adapt quite well and easily, I would say. But this is really a mental shift for us. And I think, again, that it can resonate in Japan quite a lot. But I'm quite confident in the fact that Europeans would and will be able to defend themselves if need is there.
So NATO minus America is perhaps viable, but a hub and spoke system minus the hub is much less so. Other questions from the floor, and for those listening online, please do submit your questions in the chat, and they'll be sent up to me here on stage. Yes.
My name is Shikata, a company fellow of Mitsubishi Company. Let me ask 2 questions. Ambassador pointed out that Russia is infiltrating into originally citizens of Ukraine. This is what China is doing on Taiwan. Can you think of any effective way to prevent Russia or China or any adversary countries from infiltrating in ordinary people's minds? And that's the first question. The second question is, Trump administration reminds me of the Nixon doctrine in 1969 and even Monroe doctrine in the 19th century. So I don't think this is just a phenomena caused by Trump. This might be a latent DNA of the United States. Trump just woke up such a long DNA of the United States. So we cannot rest assured, if we endure for the years, USA will come back to normal. That's not the case, I'm afraid. So what do you think about that? Thank you very much.
Marie-Doha, maybe you want to take the strategic communications part of the question. I mean, efforts to counter disinformation, to infiltrate the citizenry, the discourse from authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China. What have you learned at NATO about how to do that better?
Clearly, it's a priority. What I can say about this is that it's not new. Propaganda is not new. What is completely new, however, is the scale and the tools and the means to do this. So, of course, our take on this is from a security point of view at NATO. We don't do politics on this, but indeed, how does this affect national security and how does this affect resilience, which is the topic of this summit? What we see is that these are means to target civil society directly, to target voters' reactions. So how do we tackle this? We tackle this jointly. There is this obvious realization that no nation can face this on their own. The EU and the EIS has done a lot in defining what foreign interference is and manipulation of information, the impact on national resilience and national political life. And at NATO, we see this from both a military and a civilian perspective. So we do analyze those threats, those information threats in the information space. We do monitor them, and we do have sharing mechanisms. And actually, Japan was one of the pioneers of this as a member of the G7, because the first, rapid response mechanism was actually decided in December 18. It's already old if we think about it. It's already 6.5 years old. So this has been going on. I think then the EU has done that too. And at NATO, we created our own this year. With a sense of urgency. So indeed, those mechanisms are now alert mechanisms so that we can alert each other, amplify each other, and support each other. And NATO in that respect works like a platform. But of course, the question that is always asked is, this is defensive. Can we do something more offensive? And so, no, because we're not at war. But indeed, we are monitoring, detecting this altogether. We have means of alerting each other and of giving our political leaders the means to have joint responses. And we've seen a lot of this in the past months. Nations, neighbors calling out attacks jointly. We've seen a declaration of the ambassadors, permanent representatives of the Council, the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, jointly calling out Russian hybrid tactics targeting the different nations at the same time with very similar patterns. So yes, we are indeed considering this as a top priority.
Just to add one point, if I may, as a journalist and as someone who's spent time in Russia and Ukraine before coming to Japan, I think that the thing about these disinformation tactics is that they are like a virus. They can attack an unhealthy body. So they're effective at exacerbating existing fissures in societies. They're not very effective at creating new ones out of whole cloth. So one of the best ways, I think, of countering this kind of activity is to focus on healing the divisions within our own societies, making the body politic healthier at home. I don't know if that rings true at all to you, Federica.
If I may, yes. I think on this there are three aspects, and then I think there's a silver lining, maybe. The three aspects I see is, first, there's a hard element to that. Who owns the media? Who owns the technical channels of communication? The infrastructural part of it. I think this has and will continue to have an increasing impact on this. The second, or the social media, who owns the social media platforms. This has an impact. The second element is obviously the software, I would say. How the messages are convened, again, here you know much more than I do. There's a third element that we tend to forget often, but again, in Europe we have seen elements of that recently that to me are very worrying. We always consider the threat as coming from outside. We don't focus enough, I believe, and here comes the connection with the democratic element. We don't consider that we might have leaders, national leaders, that actually welcome foreign interference because of this connection between the domestic national political agenda and the external chessboard, I would say. And in that case, it becomes much more complicated. And this is really going back to the quality of our democracies. How do you have leaders in elected positions that detect and counter foreign interference when inappropriate? So basically, how do you make sure that you have elected leaders that preserve the quality of their democracies and democratic systems and public space? And then, last but not least, the positive element to that, maybe it's because now I'm in academia, I believe that the real antidote, effective antidote to that is education, 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 having people with critical minds. To me, that is, at bottom line, the only real thing that really works. If people grow up understanding, asking questions, being critical towards everything that they receive in terms of information, to me, this is, at the end of the day, the human capital that we need. And so this is why I actually believe that investing also in education and also information systems that are healthy ones is at the end of the day so important beyond what is done on the security front.
Shall I address the same old American bully question?
Please.
The second question. I mean, I think you're right, and that perception is particularly, to me, what differentiates a view here in Japan and actually to some degree the rest of Asia from the European view, because you have been very accustomed to being bullied by American presidents, from Nixon, of course, but to Reagan and others. That has been, if you like, the Japanese post-war experience. I'd say it's less true of Europe. Of course, we've had our arguments. We've definitely found some presidents more uncomfortable than others. But what we've not had is a president who actually says that he wants to seize part of our territory, and that's Greenland. And that is a new phenomenon, to put it mildly. So I think that the question that will be played out, as the earlier panel on the US indicated, we're at an early stage, many things are unresolved, and in this president above all, there's a high ratio of noise to signal, that you get a lot of noise, but you only detect the theme over time, the signal. What's to be played out is how aggressive, really, does he plan to be against his allies, America's traditional allies. And I take that both in trade. I would consider a 20% tariff on European exports to be pretty aggressive. And that will lead to a trade war. And that does lead to quite severe pessimism in my mind about the future transatlantic relationship. But Greenland is the big test. And he honestly, I think, will seek to try to use leverage to test whether Europe, because it's not just Denmark, Europe is going to do a deal. And the crucial thing in Europe is to make it absolutely clear that there is no such possibility, regardless. But this will be tested over the next months. He's made that clear. And that is different from previous presidents.
So we have a few questions coming in from online, and I'd like to try to weave together two of them, which have to do with changing technology and this broader security landscape we've been discussing. The prospect of greater collaboration on AI between this coalition axis of evil or quartet of chaos, whatever your preferred phrase is, if Russia, China, others in the global south collaborate more on AI, how does that change the threat landscape for Europe, for the Indo-Pacific? And a second question, somewhat connected, on communications, in particular satellite communications and efforts, if there are any, to build alternative networks to things like Elon Musk's Starlink, given potential questions about his intentions going forward. So allied collaboration on new technology and adversaries collaboration on new technology. Anyone want to take either of those on?
Maybe a short reaction to the question. It's a very valid one, and indeed collaborating on tech, and specifically AI, is one of the 4 angles that was chosen for the NATO IP4 collaboration in the Washington summit 6 months ago. So yes, it is considered a top priority. It is nothing new. I mean, NATO has a whole military command dedicated to transformation based in the US, in Norfolk, working specifically on this. And indeed, there's a clear vision that, especially given also China's tech contribution, China as an enabler of Russia's war, that we also need to be doing more of that collaboration with our like-minded partners, definitely.
If anyone has a last word, I believe we'll have to wrap up in about 2 minutes, but Bill, please take it away.
I'm only going to say that I do think a general agenda that has been rightly in governments over recent years has been de-risking, avoiding excessive dependency on a particular country as a source of a critical material. And that agenda has to apply to Elon Musk as well. In other words, there is a critical need to de-risk from a sole supplier of a particular communication technology, whatever you think of him. And you should not be that dependent. So I do think that that form of de-risking will be an important part of policy in the future.
And I'm definitely not an expert on that, so I will not add much on that. But I think that this will be an additional element of potential contrast between the US administration and the European Union, as the European Union has always been very powerful normative power, and especially with the big tech in the US, it has not shied away. And this might be one of the elements that create the friction, not that we need to have them, but this might be one of the key elements. I would maybe, as you said also about last words, an unconventional one, if I may. I know that we now normally refer to this new axis of evil, or in any case, this configuration of the four. Personally, I think that it might be slightly counterproductive from our point of view to continue to use this concept. I think that, and I know that seen from Europe, Russia is the threat today, and seen from here, it's China. And I fully understand that. But I think that it would be our joint interest to try and disarticulate this group of four as much as we can. Not that it's easy, but I think that they don't necessarily like each other. They don't necessarily trust each other. Definitely not. None of the four trusts the other three, I think, from how I know them. And I think in the future, as I really believe that we live in times of dismantling of the world global governance architecture, we will in one way or another in 5, 10, 20 years from now need to redesign a global governance architecture. I think it would be in our interests as allies, and Japan has definitely a role to play there, to try and disarticulate this group of four as much as we can. I don't think they have a completely united agenda, on the contrary, and I think that together we might be able to avoid that they cooperate more in the future.
Thank you. Very wise words, I think, to end on. Thank you to all of the esteemed panelists for sharing your thoughts, and to everyone in the audience for your attention and great questions.
Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. Please join me again in thanking the panelists. ご登壇の皆様、ありがとうございます。
Thank you, dear panelists, for your contributions and interventions.